Hello, everyone. What you're about to hear is a repeat of an episode I put out in 2018. Yes, this is the first repeat episode I'm actually doing here on Disciple Up. And, well, I'm doing this because I think it's important. I think people don't know this, and they need to know this. I'm doing this because I'm tired and I need a break, and I'm doing this because it's Christmas, and so I'm giving myself this Christmas gift. So anyway, I hope you enjoy this. Even if you've heard it before, listen again. And if you have or haven't heard it, share this with people so we can get rid of this silly fallacy that Christmas comes from pagan religions. It does not. Now, enjoy the show. Disciple Up number 87, The Non-Pagan Roots of Christmas.
This is Disciple Up, recorded live because who has time to edit these things anyway? It's the Disciple Empowering Podcast and comes to you direct from my Lenovo laptop located in the wilds of unincorporated La Paz County, Arizona, right in front of the closet in my rented single-wide trailer. It's not a mobile home because it is as immobile as it gets, so get ready because it's time to Disciple Up.
Hey everybody, welcome to Disciple Up. My name's Louie, I'm your host for this show. Glad you are with us today, and got some good stuff for you today, because we're going to tackle today and next week as well a couple of myths about Christmas. Yes, I'm going to be a mythbuster. No, not the ones on TV that made all the money, sadly. But I'm going to do a little bit of this spiritually today and next week. We will have, by the way, for next week, since it is the week of Christmas, and actually my release day falls on Christmas. So I'm going to put out a podcast next week, but it will be shorter than usual. You can thank me later. Before we jump into today's stuff here, which I think you're going to like, and for many of you, you might find this very educational. I certainly did. Years ago, I discovered this, and I'll tell you that story in a second. I want to do a couple of housekeeping things really quick. Got some new ideas for some stuff for the new year, which we'll be telling you about when the new year gets here. But as you may know, if you've been listening to our past podcasts for the last few weeks, and if you have been, congratulations, you are part of the few. But I'm glad you're out there. Thank you for listening. We're going to be tying this podcast to a sermon series, and it's actually a spiritual growth campaign that we're doing here at CCR in January and February, which means we're going to be talking about the Holy Spirit, because that's what the spiritual growth campaign is about. Now, that does not mean you have to hear the sermons or listen to the small group lessons or do the daily devotionals to make sense of what I'm going to be saying. If all you want to do is listen to this podcast, you can do it. It'll be self-contained. But even if you don't live here in Parker, you, yes, you, even you, my friends, can take part in the spiritual growth campaign, because the video lessons for the small groups and the lesson outlines will be available online for free of charge, of course. And you can listen to the sermons, of course. Those will be on the church website, as always. But you can get all the information that will be in the sermons and in the midweek or in the small group lessons, plus more, and both daily devotionals in the new book, which I just self-published. It's called Every Day in the Spirit. That's the name of the spiritual growth campaign as well. Notice how cleverly I tied them together. Always thinking, people. At any rate, you can pick that up. There'll be a link to it in the show notes. It's on Amazon.com. You can get the physical book, for those of you that like, what I call dead tree books made out of paper, for $14.99. That may sound a little pricey, but it's 572 odd pages long, which I think makes it a smoking deal. If you're an ebook person, I have good news for you. It's only $4.99. Yes, that's right. $4.99 for the Kindle version. So check that out if you'd like to be part of all that. I really think it's a good book. I wrote it, so of course I would. What I'd like, though, is for some of you to read it and then give me your honest opinion about what you think, and leave an honest review at Amazon.com. Reviews really help book sales, and I would like this book to reach a lot of people. I think it's got a lot of great information and motivation and inspiration in it, and I hope that you'll help me out with that. And having said all that, it's time to get into what we are talking about today. And what we're talking about today is this myth that you always hear about how pagan Christmas is, and Christmas was borrowed from the pagans and blah, blah, blah. Well, a few years back, it's more than a few now. It's more like, I don't know, probably, oh my goodness, I just turned something off that I needed on. Hold on. I should be able to call this up real quickly as I'm talking. You should, yes, here we go. You should be, people say, Christmas is, it's pagan, blah, blah, blah. Well, it turns out that that's actually not true. And back in probably 2008 or so, I thought this had a date on it, and it doesn't. I found something that I wrote an article off of on the blog that I had then. I used to have a blog called the Martian Chronicles. That's Marsian Chronicles, with apologies to Ray Bradbury. That was the subtitle of it. And it died after about 6 years because a hacker got to it and killed it, and I lost everything on it. But I have found this on a website. It's called Touchstone. It's an online magazine, and maybe actually a physical magazine as far as that goes, but you can find it at touchstonemag.com. There will be a link in the show notes at discipleup.org to this particular article. This is an article written by William J. Teague. Now, Mr. Teague is associate, or he was when this came out. I don't know what his status is currently, but he was the associate professor of history at Muhlenberg College in Allentown, Pennsylvania, a faculty advisor to the Catholic Campus Ministry. He's a member, or was at least, of the Jehoshaphat Ukrainian Catholic Church. Wow, there's a mouthful. Jehoshaphat, spelled Josaphat, in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, and he's a contributing editor for Touchstone, or again, at least he was. So, let's take a look at this article. It's called Calculating Christians, the Story Behind December 25th. Many Christians, he starts off, and this is very, very true. He says, many Christians think that Christians celebrate Christ's birth on December 25th because the church fathers appropriated the date of a pagan festival. Almost no one minds, except for a few groups on the fringes of American evangelicalism who seem to think that this makes Christmas itself a pagan festival. But it is perhaps interesting to know that the choice of December 25th is the result of attempts among the earliest Christians to figure out the date of Jesus' birth based on calendrical calculations that had nothing to do with pagan festivals. Rather, he says, the pagan festival of the birth of the unconquered Son, instituted by the Roman Emperor Aurelian on the 25th of December 274 AD, was almost certainly an attempt to create a pagan alternative to a date that was already of some significance to Roman Christians. Thus, the pagan origins of Christmas is a myth without historical substance. Boom, let that one sink in. So get this, and I want you to notice this because this is important, that the choice of December 25th, he wrote, is the result of attempts among the earliest Christians to figure out the date of Jesus based on, now get this, based on calendrical calculations. In other words, these people were looking at their calendars and trying to do the math, and they came up with December 25th. Now today, we may know a lot more about certain historical facts and things like that than the Christians at that time did. And so we might think that December is an odd time to put the birth of Christ. But the important point here is that this was an attempt by early Christians to figure out when Jesus was born. And that's why December 25th was picked. It was only later, 274 AD, so 274 years after Christ, that the pagan Roman Emperor Aurelian, who was a definite foe of the Christian faith, instituted the birth of the unconquered Son on that date as an alternative to Christianity. So people say, oh, this was put on this pagan day as an alternative to pagan beliefs. Actually, the truth is it's just the opposite. Now, the idea that the date was taken from the pagans goes back to two scholars from the late 17th and early 18th centuries. Paul Ernst Jablonski, a German Protestant, wished to show that the celebration of Christ's birth on December 25th was one of the many, quote, paganizations, unquote, of Christianity that the Church of the 4th century embraced as one of the many, quote, degenerations, unquote, that transformed pure apostolic Christianity into Catholicism. Dom Jean Hardouin, I'm probably pronouncing that last name totally wrong, as a Benedictine monk, tried to show that the Catholic Church adopted pagan festivals for Christian purposes without paganizing the gospel. So you got two guys, late 17th, early 18th centuries, trying to make a point. And in the process, and this happens a lot, by the way, when you use history to try to make points, you'd better be careful, because this is what ends up happening a lot. You end up misusing history and actually undermining your point. In the Julian calendar, which was created in 45 BC under Julius Caesar, the winter solstice fell on December 25th, and it therefore seemed obvious to Jablonski and Hardouin that the day must have had a pagan significance before it had a Christian one. But in fact, the date had no religious significance in the Roman pagan festival calendar before Aurelian's time, nor did the cult of the sun play a prominent role in Rome before him. Did you hear that? Yes, December 25th is the winter solstice under the Julian calendar, but it had no religious significance to the ancient Romans prior to Aurelian in 274 A.D. Boom. There were two temples of the sun in Rome, one of which, maintained by a clan into which Aurelian was born or adopted, celebrated its dedication festival on August 9th, the other of which celebrated its dedication festival on August 28th. But both of these cults fell into neglect in the 2nd century when Eastern cults of the sun, such as Mithraism, began to win a following in Rome. And in any case, none of these cults, old or new, had festivals associated with solstices or equinoxes. Now, there are other places in the world, many places actually, where you can find all kinds of religious festivals associated with the solstice or the equinox, but not the Romans. As things actually happened, Aurelian, who ruled from 270 until his assassination in 275, didn't last long, did he, was hostile to Christianity and appears to have promoted the establishment of the festival of the birth of the unconquered sun as a device to unify the various pagan cults of the Roman Empire around a commemoration of the annual rebirth of the sun. He led an empire that appeared to be collapsing in the face of internal unrest, rebellions in the provinces, economic decay, and repeated attacks from German tribes in the north and the Persians to the east. In creating this new feast, he intended the beginning of the lengthening of the daylight and the arresting of the lengthening of darkness on December 25th to be a symbol of the hoped-for rebirth or perpetual rejuvenation of the Roman Empire, resulting from the maintenance of the worship of the gods, whose tutelage, or so the Romans thought, had brought Rome to greatness and world rule. If it co-opted the Christian celebration, well, so much the better. It is true that the first evidence of Christians celebrating December 25th as the date of the Lord's Nativity comes from Rome some years after Aurelian in AD 336. But there is evidence from both the Greek East and the Latin West that Christians attempted to figure out the date of Christ's birth long before they began to celebrate it liturgically, even in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. The evidence indicates, in fact, the attribution of the date of December 25th was a byproduct of attempts to determine when to celebrate his death and resurrection. How did this happen? There's a seeming contradiction between the date of the Lord's death as given in the Synoptic Gospels and in John's Gospel. The Synoptics would appear to place it on Passover Day, after the Lord celebrated the Passover meal on the preceding evening, and John on the eve of Passover, just when the Passover lambs were being slaughtered in the Jerusalem temple for the feast that was to ensue after sunset on that day. Solving this problem involves answering questions of whether the Lord's Supper was a Passover meal or a meal celebrated a day earlier, and we're not going to get into that right now. Suffice it to say that the early church followed John rather than the synoptics, and thus believed that Christ's death would have taken place on 14 Nisan, according to the Jewish lunar calendar. Modern scholars agree, by the way, that the death of Christ could have taken place only in AD 30 or 33, as those two are the only years of that time when the eve of Passover could have fallen on a Friday, the possibilities being either 7th of April 30 or 3rd of April 33 AD. However, as the early church was forcibly separated from Judaism, it entered into a world with different calendars and had to devise its own time to celebrate the Lord's Passion, not least so as to be independent from the rabbinic calculations of the date of Passover. Also, since the Jewish calendar was a lunar calendar, consisting of 12 months of 30 days each, every few years a 13th month had to be added by a decree of the Sanhedrin to keep the calendar in synchronization with the equinoxes and the solstices, as well as to prevent seasons from straying into inappropriate months. Apart from the difficulty Christians would have had in following or perhaps even accurately being informed about the dating of Passover in any given year, to follow a lunar calendar of their own devising would have set them at odds with both Jews and pagans, and very likely embroiled them in endless disputes among themselves. The 2nd century saw severe disputes about whether Passover had always had to fall on a Sunday or a weekday or the other kind of stuff. So they were having all kinds of arguments, obviously, because of calendrical differences, which makes perfect sense. These difficulties played out in different ways among the Greek Christians in the eastern part of the empire and the Latin Christians in the western part of it. Greek Christians seem to have wanted to find a date equivalent to 14th Nisan on their own solar calendar, and since Nisan was the month in which the spring equinox occurred, no, it was not a car made in Japan, it's not spelled the same either. Nisan, the Jewish month is Nisan. So it's not the same thing, folks. They chose the 14th day of Artemision, which was, again, their calendar, not ours, the month in which the spring equinox invariably fell on their own calendar. Around AD 300, the Greek calendar was superseded by the Roman calendar, and since the dates of the beginnings and endings of the months in these two systems did not coincide, 14th of Artemision became April 6th. Are you confused yet? Because I know I am. So it's easy to understand why they would have been confused if we're confused, just going over this without all of the endless mathematical details that it would entail. In contrast, 2nd century Latin Christians in Rome and North Africa appear to have desired to establish the historical date on which the Lord Jesus died. By the time of Tertullian, they had concluded he died on Friday, the 25th of March, 29 AD. As an aside, I will note that this is impossible. 25th of March, 29 was not a Friday, and a Passover Eve in AD 29 did not fall on a Friday and was not on March 25th or in March at all. So they made a mistake, as they probably made a mistake on the birth of Christ. It's highly doubtful he was actually born on December 25th, but can't prove it. So in the East, we have April 6th. In the West, March 25th. At this point, we have to introduce a belief that seems to have been widespread in Judaism at the time of Christ, but which, as it is nowhere taught in the Bible, has completely fallen out of the awareness of Christians. The idea is that of a, quote, integral age, unquote, of the great Jewish prophets. The idea that the prophets of Israel died on the same dates as their births or conception. Again, this is not biblical, but this is a belief that apparently during the time of Christ, around that time, many Jews believed, maybe most. This notion is a key factor in understanding how some early Christians came to believe that December 25th is the date of Christ's birth. The early Christians applied this idea to Jesus, so that March 25th and April 6th were not only the supposed dates of Christ's birth, but of his conception or birth as well. There is some fleeting evidence that at least some 1st and 2nd century Christians thought of March 25th or April 6th as the date of Christ's birth, but rather quickly the assignment of March 25th as the date of Christ's conception prevailed. It is, to this day, commemorated almost universally among Christians as the Feast of the Annunciation, which the Archangel Gabriel, when the Archangel, man, I can't talk, I really can. When the Archangel Gabriel brought the good tidings of a Savior to the Virgin Mary, upon whose acquiescence the eternal Word of God, light of light, true God of true God, begotten of the Father before all ages, as the confession says, forthwith became incarnate in her womb. What is the length of pregnancy? 9 months. Add 9 months to March 25th, and you get December 25th. Add it to April 6th, and you get January 6th. December 25th is Christmas. January 6th is Epiphany. Christmas, December 25th, is a feast of Western Christian origin. In Constantinople, it appears to have been introduced in about 379 or 380 AD. From a sermon of St. John Chrysostom, at that time a renowned ascetic and preacher in his native Antioch, it appears that the feast was first celebrated there on 25th of December, 386 AD. From these centers, it spread throughout the Christian East, being adopted in Alexandria around 432, and in Jerusalem a century or more later. The Armenians, alone among ancient Christian churches, have never adopted it. And to this day, they celebrate Christ's birth, manifestation to the Magi, and baptism on January 6th. Western churches, in turn, generally adopted the January 6th Epiphany feast from the East, Rome doing so sometime during or between 366 and 394 AD. But in the West, the feast was generally presented as the commemoration of the visit of the Magi to the infant Christ, and as such, it was an important feast, but not one of the most important ones. A striking contrast to its position in the East, where it remains the second most important festival of the church year, second only to Easter. In the East, Epiphany far outstrips Christmas. The reason is that the feast celebrates Christ's baptism in the Jordan and the occasion on which the voice of the Father and the descent of the Spirit both manifested for the first time to mortal men the divinity of the incarnate Christ and the Trinity of the persons in the one Godhead. Thus, December 25th is the date of Christ's birth. Let me read this sentence again. Thus, December 25th, as the date of Christ's birth, appears to owe nothing whatsoever to pagan influences upon the practice of the church during or after Constantine's time. It is wholly unlikely to have been the actual date of Christ's birth, but it arose entirely from the efforts of early Latin Christians to determine the historical date of Christ's birth. And the pagan feast, which the Emperor Aurelian instituted on that date in the year 274, was not only an effort to use the winter solstice to make a political statement, but also, almost certainly, an attempt to give a pagan significance to a date already of importance to Roman Christians. The Christians, in turn, could at a later date reappropriate the pagan birth of the unconquered Son to refer to the occasion of the birth of Christ. And they said that it was the rising of the, quote, Son of Salvation, unquote, or, quote, the Son of Justice, unquote. So there you go. Wow. I could have titled this episode of Disciple Up as Everything You've Ever Heard About Christmas is Wrong. That wouldn't quite be right, but it certainly would almost apply to the things that people just assume. And y'all know what assume means, don't ya? And here's just some more evidence that that's the truth, because everybody thinks they know that this is all just, comes from the pagans and blah, blah, blah. But guess what? They're wrong. It doesn't. So there you go. Some food for thought on that. Now, last week, I talked to you a little bit about, and I read to you what C.S. Lewis wrote about Christmas, his little article, What Christmas Means to Me, and I was hoping to get some interesting feedback on that. I did not, so there you go. But in the book, which I mentioned last week, God in the Dock, there are a couple of other articles on Christmas as well, and they're focused on the same theme, and that is there's a spiritual Christmas, and then there's the kind of the culture, what I call the cultural Christmas, or the economic Christmas, or the way we celebrate Christmas. So he focuses that the same. So if you decided you wanted to pick up God in the Dock, which again, if you missed last week's episode, is available at Amazon and other places. It's a book of articles and things that C.S. Lewis wrote that were compiled after his death and published. And no, does not refer to God pulling into the harbor and tying up at the wharf. God in the Dock refers to God in the witness stand, because much of what you'll read in God in the Dock is apologetic in nature, defending or explaining the faith. So that's where that kind of odd-sounding title, to American ears, odd-sounding title, that's where it comes from. And so you might want to be sure and check those out as well as you think about Christmas this year. But I wanted to share this because it just shows you how easy it is. You listen to things and people tell you things, and you think that, you just sort of, everybody says it, and so you actually believe it. But it turns out that it's not true. That these things that we think we know, we actually don't know. And everybody just assumes that this pagan holiday, that Christmas comes from a pagan holiday, that it's just borrowed, and that somehow celebrating, even if that was true, it's interesting that the connection is made that in people's minds, well, look at there, it's a pagan thing and you guys borrowed it, so that proves that it's not true. Well, I don't really know how that proves whether it's true or not. It doesn't prove anything in the first place. It's not a paganization of the Christian faith. And but now it turns out when you actually look at the facts and do a little digging, that it has nothing to do with paganism at all. It's just what early Christians arrived at using the best information that they had. Now, their information was flawed, but they did the best they could with what they had, which is all anybody can do. All we can do is go with the light that we have on any topic at any given time. And you can almost always look back and you can say, well, gosh, if I knew back then, say when I was 27 years old, I made a big decision back then. 27, 28 years old, I decided I was going to get married. In spite of the fact I didn't really know this girl, and but I, felt like that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to put down roots, blah, blah, blah. Well, if I knew then what I know now, I wouldn't have married her. But I didn't know then what I know now. And I'm not just referring to if I knew then how things turned out. If I just knew then, if I had understood myself better, understood the concept of boundaries and codependence, and if I had understood the whole concept of really being patient and waiting on God to bring things into our lives that He wants as opposed to the things that we want and all that, I would have made a different decision. But I didn't. All I had to go on back then was what I had. That's all anybody has. So instead of looking back and down at the early Christians and say, oh, those idiots, what was wrong with them? Oh, hey, they were just being human, just like you are. So let's give them some grace. Let's cut them some slack, because I'll tell you what, I'm certainly always wanting God to extend grace and love to me. And I think that what's going on in the world right now, speaking of Christmas, as we approach Christmas, all this political correctness. Well, I think this generation that's all hopped up and charged up about this is going to someday in the not far distant future, like one generation hints from now, is going to wish somebody would cut them some slack, because they're going to get it just like they're giving it to people right now. I read a fascinating article this week showing you how, and you say, how does this relate to Christmas? Here's how. God sent his son into the world to save us, to give us grace, to die in our place and give us salvation as a gift. Right? Right. What have we been seeing all over this country in the last, couple of years, especially this last year? People are wanting to tear down statues and erase things and destroy art and cover everything else because it's offensive, quote unquote, and that the people that these statues or that these streets were named after or whatever, they had flaws. Well, guess what happened just last week? Last week, a statue was torn down in Africa. It was torn down because it was racist, because the man that this statue was made of, a man whose name this man was racist. Well, who was this racist? Well, he must have been an Englishman or an American, maybe a Frenchman, because the English and French colonized much of Africa. No, actually, he was an Indian, a guy from India, and you know his name. His name, most people know him by Mahatma Gandhi. Mahatma Gandhi, racist? Why, what's wrong with those people in Africa? Well, turns out the reason that they think he was racist was because he was. He actually lived for a time in South Africa, and when he was there, worked hard for the rights of Indians. He wanted the British in South Africa, to view the Indians, as they viewed themselves. He wanted them to be viewed higher than the black native Africans that were there, because he felt they were superior to the Africans, who he viewed as genetically, racially inferior. So yeah, you didn't know that about Gandhi, did you? No. Gandhi, the real Gandhi, who people worked very hard at not talking to you about, had a lot of weird things going on in his life. By the way, he was at his father's deathbed. He had just married shortly before that. Yes, Gandhi was married for a while. Left his father on his deathbed to go have sex with his wife, and by the time he got back, his father was dead. It's a little harsh. I'm all for married people having sex with each other, within their marriage, of course, but, couldn't you have waited? And later in life, when he was very ascetic and all that, he, quote, tested, unquote, himself by sleeping nude with 2 teenage nieces, young girls in their teens who slept with, I think they're actually grandnieces, so let's just call him Grandpa, so he could test his celibacy, his commitment to it. That a little weird? Seems a little weird to me. Seems like that would be a good way to go to jail. If you tried that today and people found out about it, you would be in huge trouble. That is some of the other side of Mahatma Gandhi. Gandhi was a human being, just like all of us. He had failures. He had flaws. How many people in this country would be appalled at the thought of tearing down a statue to the great peacemaker? Remember, Mahatma is Hindu for the great soul. Well, the great soul had some great flaws, just like the rest of us do. That's why Christmas is important, because that's when Jesus came into the world to forgive sinners like you, like me, like Gandhi, like every other person, man or woman, whose statue's been torn down or whose name been taken off something or whatever. They were all people. They were all sinners, just like the people who now, with what I consider to be maybe a little more self-righteousness than they need to have, are trying to efface and erase that. And you just need to be careful with it. No, I don't want anyone going to Adolf Hitler High School or anything like that, of course. But we have to realize that when you look back on people and their whole life comes out historically, there's going to be problems with them. Just as if my whole life came out, a lot of people would be really disappointed because, I'm a sinner and so are you. We need a Savior. And God knew that far better than we do, and he sent us one, his son Jesus. And that's what Christmas is all about, and that's where our focus should be at Christmas, not on dates or pagan origins or whatever. But I took the time today to share this with you because it annoys me that people will throw this out and then write off Christmas and write off the Christian faith because of it. Well, the next time that happens, refer them to this episode of the podcast and tell them, hey, you're wrong, because they are wrong. And that's going to wrap it up for this edition. I'll give you a little Christmas present early. This is a little shorter than usual, but that's okay, because here at Disciple Up, we do our thing, and then we get out of the way, because I know your time's valuable, and so's mine. So I hope that today's episode blessed you. I'd love to hear from you. Email me, Louie, L-O-U-I-E, at discipleup.org. Go to the Facebook page, leave a comment, facebook.com/discipleup. Think and pray about getting the book. I really think it will be a blessing to you. Obviously, tons of effort over literally over years of time to write this book off and on. I've been working on this book since 2012.
CCR does not sponsor, pay for, or necessarily approve the content found there.
Give it a shot.
Music for Disciple Up is
I think it'll be a blessing to you.
Yes,
I hope that you will be participating with us in Everyday in the Spirit. Whether you're distant or here in town, you can do it. It's all going to be out there. Take advantage of that.
However, where the opinions, thoughts, impressions, and feelings shared are in line with God's Word and faithfully represent what our Lord says in His holy word, the Bible,
next time, remember that every time is a good time.
If you're wondering how the heck you're supposed to know this, remember, God tells you to test all things.
Bless you.
Hold on to the truth.
So
it's up
long.
to you to do the due diligence that God commands, so do it. Don't whine about it, and don't complain about how hard it is. Don't blame me for it. Disciple Up, and do what you know you're supposed to do. If you'd like to know more about Louie or Disciple Up, please go to discipleup.org and check out everything you find there. Or not, it's completely up to you. Disciple Up, the Empowering Disciples podcast will, God willing, publish an episode every week covering different areas of concern to disciples of Jesus. If that's important to you, then please subscribe on iTunes, Google, Stitcher, or another one of the many podcast aggregators available to you. If it's not, then don't. If you'd like to get in touch, please email Louie at louie@discipleup.org. God bless you.